In February of this year, Facebook news feeds exploded with information about human sex trafficking in America. From an article about its connection to the Super Bowl, to the pro and counter arguments, to the publicizing of the End It project, people couldn't hit the share button fast enough. How could we allow horrors like this to happen under our very noses? How could we be so blind? We usually think about sex trafficking as one of those foreign problems, and the fact that there's such an organized system here in our own country is, as it should be, shocking. Praise God, light is being shown on this very dark part of the broken world we live in. However, it's time to shine some light on another form of sexual slavery. Even though it isn't as organized, it's even more prevalent. It permeates our schools, neighborhoods, churches, even our own backyards. I'm referring to childhood sexual abuse. For the next few minutes, I'll be sharing some information to answer 3 questions. What is classified as sexual abuse? Who are the victims? And who are the perpetrators? So first off, what is sexual abuse exactly? In her book, Kids Helping Kids, Linda Lee Foltz collected 15 stories of children who had been abused and coupled it with counsel and advice. She clearly defines sexual abuse as any time you are asked, tricked, or forced by someone who is bigger, older, or stronger than you, or by someone who has power over you into a sexual activity. They will want you to do secret touching or non-touching activities that involve private parts or the private parts of someone else. It goes on to describe the difference between touching and non-touching abuse. Non-touching would be things like showing pornography to the child, exposure of each other's private parts, this is called exhibitionism, making the child pose for pictures, naked or in revealing clothes, perhaps in sexual positions, watching the child undress or bathe in an inappropriate manner, and sexual harassment. The types of abuse that are touching: someone touching a child's privates or asking a child to touch theirs, this could be with or without clothing, oral sex, and sex itself, intercourse, whether it's forced or coaxed, or forcing a foreign object into a child. Okay, so by its very definition, sexual abuse is horrible, but it doesn't happen that often, right? Sadly wrong. This leads us to question 2. Who are the victims? Like any problem our children face, it's hard to narrow it down to just one demographic. In other words, since this is a moral issue, not a physical or genetic issue, it isn't confined to one race, social status, financial situation, or location. Let's look at some of the most common problems our children face in America. In 2009, there were an estimated 10,000 children hospitalized due to gun violence, whether accidental or deliberate. The American Cancer Society estimated that this year about 10,450 children will be diagnosed with cancer in some form or another. Jumping up the scale a bit, about 149,000 children were either injured or killed in car accidents in 2011. In 2012, there were approximately 273,000 cases of sexual abuse reported to the Children's Bureau of the United States Department of Health and Human Services. As if that wasn't enough, another study tells us that only 5% of sexual assaults were reported. That means that there were 5,460,000 sexual abuse victims in 2012 alone. These are children with names. 1 out of 4 girls and 1 out of 6 boys will experience sexual abuse of some kind by the time they reach 18. Just think about that. That's 25 and 16% of all children in this country alone. This is an epidemic, but no one is talking about it. Why? What is it about sexual abuse that is so hurtful that we dare not even speak about it? The tragedy of abuse is that the abuser forces a child to have a sexual encounter too early in life. Sexuality is for a child to develop naturally, to be able to choose when to share it when they get married. Kids aren't old enough to know exactly what's going on, so they don't know that their sexuality is reserved only for their spouse. That's where the job of the parents comes in. Parents often avoid talking with their kids about sex. It's probably something they inherited from their parents, and so on. They think that keeping kids away from knowing about sex will preserve their childhood innocence for as long as possible. But parents, hear me on this. There's a big difference between innocence and ignorance. Be real with your kids. I recommend talking with your kids from a really early age about how their private parts are just that, private. Then, as the child gets older, talk to them about what these parts are for, and then tell them what sex is. Obviously, you have to take into account how mature they are, both physically and mentally, but don't shy away from their questions. Would you rather they find out about sex from you telling them about it, or from someone else showing them? If you keep an honest, open conversation about sex, then if something does happen to them, they won't feel scared to talk to you about it. A child's sexuality is like an underground minefield that every child walks through. Not knowing it's there won't make a difference about whether or not it affects them. In fact, knowing about it will help them to tread more carefully, especially if you, the parent, give them a map of where the individual minds are. There's a natural sense of curiosity that children have about their own bodies, as well as the bodies of others. Kids just know that there's this thing that people talk about, and the code of euphemism and innuendo. And because parents joke about dreading the birds and the bees talk with their kids, they often have to figure out these things for themselves. As a result, many children have sexual encounters with each other that they look back on with shame and regret. The link between child sex exploration and shame is, I believe, the main component for why sexual abuse is a taboo subject. Even people that weren't abused by adults are reminded of uncomfortable things from their childhood, and then associate their own shame with it. When a child is abused but can't talk about it, it often comes out in other, subtler ways. No two victims will have the same reaction to sexual abuse. However, there are some common traits to be on the lookout for. Some kids will react by lashing out, like aggression, violent tendencies, defensive or untrusting attitudes, disrespect of authority, showing uncommon knowledge of sexuality, like acting out sexually with a sibling or other children, or making toys behave sexually. Or a child might react by closing in on themselves, like isolation and withdrawal, depression, anxiety, lack of interest in former hobbies, not wanting to undress or bathe near anyone, or avoidance of a particular place or person, especially if they used to enjoy being around them. There are some physical traits as well. PTSD symptoms. Some victims have the same symptoms as soldiers who were in combat, like flinching if you try to touch them, or being really jumpy and jittery. Regressive behavior, basically unmaturing, like starting to wet the bed again, or acting younger than they should. Urinary tract infections, complaints of pain in stomach or groin, blood in underwear, especially if the child isn't a teenage girl, sore throats. In Kids Helping Kids, the victims were asked what they wished adults knew. Over and over again they said, "I wish my parents had paid attention. I wish they had noticed when I started acting different. I wish they'd asked me why I suddenly became angry or violent or isolated." Instead, these behaviors are often used as evidence against the victim. "Jake is so disrespectful. You can't believe anything he says. Abby's always misbehaved. She can't be trusted. Erica is such a drama queen. She's probably just making it up for attention." Question 3. Who are the perpetrators? What kind of person would even do this kind of thing? I wish there was a specific demographic of person we could identify as pedophiles. Then we could just round them up and put them in jail before they hurt anyone. The trouble is, you can't tell if a person is an abuser until they actually do something. Sometimes it's obvious, like the creepy guys in the white van. We all remember hearing, "Don't talk to strangers, don't take candy from strangers, don't get in cars with strangers." But in reality, only 14% of sexual perpetrators are strangers to the child, making stranger danger programs obsolete. That means that 86% of perpetrators are people like teachers, coaches, scout leaders, neighbors, older children. Side note here, oftentimes if a child is abused by an older child, it's a good indicator that the older child is themselves being abused by someone else. And people like babysitters, friends of the family, and probably most tragic, family members and religious leaders. people that the child knows, trusts, and loves. Fultz says, if you walk down the street, you wouldn't be able to pick out a sexual abuser. He or she doesn't look any different or do things openly that are different from the other people who live around you. If the people around you go to work, school, or church, the abuser will go too. But privately, when no one else can see, an abuser will develop a slow, trusting relationship with kids, and eventually trick or force kids into sexual activity. Even though no two abuse cases are identical, they all have one thing in common: secrets. An abuser will tell its victim that the abuse is their little secret. That's how they can get away with what they do. It all depends on the silence of the victims. They might threaten the child. You better not talk about what I did or I'll hurt your parents. Or they'll use promises. If you keep it a secret, I'll take you to the park and get you ice cream. Or maybe they'll guilt the child. If you tell, I'll get in trouble and you'll never see me again. They often will try to isolate a child from their family or safe parent, building a world that's just the two of them. They single the kid out, form a strong relationship with them, often going out of their way to do nice things for them. They buy them gifts, take them places, say that they're special. They might treat the kid with adult privileges like tobacco or alcohol or porn. This is often referred to as grooming. It's their way of making a child do what they want. Sometimes a child will feel guilty for accepting presents for sexual favors, like it's somehow their fault, that they could have just said no if they hadn't been greedy. On the flip side, their abuser could tell the victim that they did something wrong and that the abuse is punishment for it. Both are lies. An abuser always has the choice. No matter what the child says or does, it is never, ever the child's fault. Fultz continues, the victim was confused because her uncle wasn't hurting her. Like the victim, most kids think touches have to hurt to be abusive, but that's not true. Sexual activities don't have to hurt, and sometimes they even feel good. In fact, it's often in the so-called gentle abuse that kids feel the most confusion. God made sex to be a gift, something to be enjoyed when a man and woman come together in marriage to make a beautiful picture of Christ and the church. Therefore, our bodies were made to feel pleasure when they're sexually stimulated. A perpetrator might use this to their advantage. Grooming can also be a way to safeguard against conviction if the child does tell. Adults often only see the way perpetrators help kids. Like that coach that's been so generous with one-on-one practices, or that teacher that offers free tutoring to that one student, or that teenage neighbor that only wants to spend time with that one kid. Oh, Mr. Jones couldn't possibly do something like that. He's so nice. Laura is so helpful, always looking for ways to serve in the church nursery. She wouldn't hurt a soul. John is such a community leader. There's no way he'd do that. This leads me to my final point. No matter how far-fetched, always, always, always believe the child. Why? Only 1% of abuse accusations prove to be false. 1%. Too many kids who finally work up the courage to speak are crushed by the disbelief of the people that they tell. In fact, it can feel like they're being re-abused. It is extremely painful for a victim to talk about what they've been through. Why would they put themselves through that if they were lying? Rarely, a child might accuse the wrong person, but that's still an indication that something's wrong. Besides, they couldn't come up with stuff like that on their own. Someone must have been teaching them. Thankfully, Scripture says that at the end of days, everything will be found out. Luke 8:17 says, "For nothing is concealed that won't be revealed, and nothing hidden that won't be made known and come to light."